Okay, so welcome to this video. My name's Roger Hallam. I'm a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and one of the co-leaders of the new anti-political party Burning Pink. I'm very pleased today to be talking to Chris Hedges from America. I'm sure many of you watching this video will know Chris well from all the books and articles and activism he's been involved in for the last 20 or 30 years. What we're going to do in this video is have a conversation about the present state of affairs in the state of the world, as it were, and Biden's victory, or hopefully victory in the US election. You never know, but and also look more concretely at what needs to happen in order to make concrete and viable challenges to the deaf system that we now face globally in relation to the social catastrophe and ecological catastrophes that are happening. And I'd like to move on finally to talking a little bit more about our relationship to the truth and how the truth is an enormously powerful way of communicating at this particular time in history. So they're all big themes, and we don't know whether we'll totally cover everything in this interview. But I think it's important to look at the conversation, look at the situation globally and broadly, because it's very easy, as I'm sure everyone's aware, to get bogged down in the specifics of what's happening this week and next week and what have you. So, Chris, thank you very much for talking to me. That's great. We've had one or two chats, haven't we, before? And what I would like to ask you, first of all, is obviously we've had this situation with everyone, it seems, piling in behind Biden, both in America and globally, in order to defeat Trump. And in many ways, this is understandable because of the obscenity of what Trump represents and his behavior. But there's a major problem as well, isn't there? And I feel like both of us have sort of seen this many times before, is this tendency to compromise our truth and our analysis and what have you in order to stop the worst thing from happening. So I'm wondering, is that how you see it? And how do you see the situation in America at this moment in time?
Well, it's worse than compromising truth. It's selling out. The Democratic Party in Europe would be a far-right party. It's a party of imperial war. It supports these massive military budgets, subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, austerity, trade agreements, wholesale surveillance of the public, violating our right to privacy, the largest penal system, prison system in the world, 25% of the world's prison population, and the worst social inequality that we've ever seen in American history. That is all the Democratic Party. And what we have seen is a steadily descending political landscape, which ended up 4 years ago producing Trump. But Trump was a symptom. Trump's not the disease. And he is the symptom of a system that has been seized by a global corporate cabal and small group of oligarchs who deform and distort and destroy democratic institutions to further consolidate their power and their wealth. It's the lobbyists on K Street who write the laws. The Supreme Court is a wholly owned subsidiary of corporate America. The mass media is totally controlled by corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, the use of algorithms to lock people like myself out, courtesy of Silicon Valley. So this is, Trump is what you get, what you vomit up, which I saw in the former Yugoslavia, when the system no longer functions. And Biden was selected by the oligarchs because he will maintain that system, and they hope, probably correctly, restore a kind of decorum and gravitas to the imperial presidency. And we know that he was selected because the major donors to the Democratic Party, Lloyd Blankfein, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, and others publicly made it clear that if Bernie Sanders was the nominee, they would vote for Trump. So this whole notion of the least worst, you have to support the least worst, only applies to people like you and me. It doesn't apply to them. And the problem is that the liberal elites, and this goes back all the way to the Clinton administration. And for viewers, just to be clear, much of the most egregious assaults on the working class were actually carried out under the presidency of Bill Clinton. You had the 1994 omnibus crime bill, which tripled and quadrupled sentences and almost doubled our prison population. You had NAFTA, the free trade agreement, which saw hundreds of thousands of union jobs exported, towns with their factories closed down because they went to Monterrey, Mexico, or China, or somewhere else, throwing people into deep despair and barely subsistence level existence. You had the destruction of our welfare system that was under Clinton, and 70% of the original recipients were children. You had the deregulation of the Federal Communications Commission, which allowed about a half dozen corporations to seize the airwaves, and about 90% of what Americans listen to or watch are now in the hands of these. That was Clinton. And then, of course, Glass-Steagall, that had built firewalls between commercial and investment banks. The 1933 law in response to the Depression was abolished and precipitated in large part the banking crisis that was part of the 2008 meltdown. Canada did not have a banking crisis because Chrétien did not abolish the regulations that did not allow investment or commercial banks to act like investment financial firms. So all of this came under the Democrats, and that betrayal and the refusal on the part of the liberal elites to stand up for the working class and the values that they purport to hold has diminished or destroyed, I would say, their credibility. And so in this election cycle with Biden, it was one more example of the liberal elites surrendering everything they claim to support. Now, there's a short-term advantage to that in getting rid of Trump, but the long-term damage, especially in the crisis that we live in, is incalculable because the liberal class has no credibility. People, and they have demonstrated repeatedly that they won't stand up and fight for what they believe in, and that's what frightens me. I saw that in Yugoslavia. You can go back and you see the same kind of bankruptcy of the ruling elites in Weimar, and that essentially greenlights a proto-fascism that's rising throughout the country.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people, a lot of progressive people, a lot of people on the left, and a lot of normal people, as you might say as well, would sort of agree with this analysis. I mean, it's nothing particularly radical nowadays to identify the whole corruption of the system. I think something like 80% of people in Britain, for instance, are completely fed up with the political class, and that's a historic high and what have you. I think where the nub here, though, is, as you're aware, a lot of people, and this goes back 2 or 3 decades to 1989, will say to you, Chris, yes, you're right. But at the end of the day, Biden's better than Trump, and we've got to get Trump in. And therefore, we have to submit ourselves to this leadership of what you might call the liberal class. So what's your specific tactical reply to that, as you might say? You see what I mean? For people that basically agree with what you're saying.
Well, this is a very short-term and transitory response because the Biden administration will now ensure the rise of a competent fascist. Biden and everyone around him are already seeing the appointments, including a Democratic congressman who gets huge funding from the fossil fuel industry being appointed to the EPA. I mean, Biden will continue that old neoliberal imperialist order, and people are sick of it. And Trump, for all of his many faults and vulgarities and ineptitude and dishonesty and everything else, is not a fascist. He has no ideology. He may be an instinctive fascist, but he doesn't have an ideology. He has filled that ideological vacuum with the ideology of the radical Christian right. I call them American fascists, and I speak as a former seminarian. And we're already seeing figures like Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, Tom Cotton, a senator from Arkansas. These figures are competent fascists. And if Biden, I think the ruling elites are thrilled with Biden because they think it's all going to go back to the way it was. And that attempt to make it go back to the way it was is our death sentence on every level, politically, in terms of climate, economically, and so at best, it's a 4 years respite. I will say that once Trump leaves the White House, if he leaves the White House, and I think the only thing that probably ensures that he will leave the White House is that he's, again, too disorganized and too unfocused and too incompetent to stage the kind of coup that he is attempting to stage. He clearly would do it if he could. And for people outside the United States, that means getting state legislatures to overturn the election results, or not overturn them, but essentially announce them as fraudulent and appoint the electors to our electoral college. He would have to do that in about 4 states. And he's been meeting with legislators from Michigan to essentially do that. And then the electoral college, it's not the popular vote that determines the presidency. Clinton won 3 million more votes than Trump. It's the electors.
Yeah.
But you will then see, and the Republican Party has been an accessory to this or in the process of it, this attempted coup. And then we're finished. And so I think that when I look at the liberal elites, the progressives, what I see is them committing collective suicide by refusing to, as Václav Havel said, living in truth, standing fast to the very moral imperatives and political positions that they have, by constantly selling them out, which is what they have done once again at a moment of crisis, and we're reaching that crisis. They become figures of ridicule.
Yeah, so I think if I've got you right, you're making a very interesting analytical point here, as I see it, which is, a lot of people who traditionally won't be part of this grand liberal coalition, they will be seen as sort of moralists, as you might say. I can't support Biden because, he's too right-wing for me. But the sensible realists, supporting Biden because at least he's not as bad as Trump. But what you're saying is you're making, as I understand it, a realist argument or an analytical argument, a tactical argument, which is if you continue to support the liberal class, a liberal president, in inverted commas, then basically you're facilitating an even more competent and horrendous fascist threat in 4 years' time. In other words, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot because a liberal president like Biden is essentially facilitating a greater corruption, which is going to create a greater right-wing revolt. Is that right? That's basically what you're saying.
Yeah, and I would also add that politics is a game of fear. So this is why I was Ralph Nader's speechwriter, why I haven't voted for a Democrat since before 2000. I did not vote for Biden. I voted for the Green Party. There was only 600,000 of us. But Ralph understood, nobody knows corporate power in America better than Ralph Nader. Nobody's been fighting it longer with more integrity than Ralph Nader. And Ralph saw corporate power essentially carry out what John Ralston calls our coup d'etat in slow motion. And he ran, and not because he thought he would win, he knew he wouldn't win, but the idea was to draw 5, 10, 15 million voters away from the Democratic Party and begin to put pressure on the Democratic Party to respond to all of the issues, including climate change. Never forget that the first Earth Day was organized by Ralph Nader. And the machinery of the two-party duopoly was so powerful and I was involved in those campaigns, that they just made it impossible. They locked Ralph out of the debates. Who'd want to interview Ralph? He's one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. You need insane amounts of money. I mean, but these two presidential campaigns each cost roughly $1.5 billion. And it's all advertising. And then the media is complicit because they make their money from it. You can't run for a seat in the House unless you can raise over $1 million. Money is just so saturated the elections that if you don't have those resources, and then you have the two parties, for instance, controlling the debates. The Presidential Commission on Debates is owned by the two parties. They decide the format, they decide who gets to sit on it, and it's even if primaries, people are locked out. So it's about creating pressure, and that's the only way throughout history elites respond. And unfortunately, we are now in a historical moment, which has been replicated in other eras and other times, where the self-identified liberal elites have proven that they will fight for nothing and stand for nothing. And in a moment of extremists, and we're certainly reaching one in the United States with the heavy economic fallout that is besetting the country, the only people who have the kind of courage of their convictions are these proto-fascists. That's where we are.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, like a lot of people will probably agree with you, and a lot of people presumably wouldn't vote for Biden and didn't vote for Biden. I think 40% or whatever the population didn't vote at all in the US, and obviously some people voted for the Green Party and what have you. But I think it's easy, isn't it, to criticize, right? And it's necessary, but it's insufficient. And I've spent much of my political life, as you know, like trying to design what the practical response is to terrible things that are going on. And it's essential to have that radical analysis to say that the system is fundamentally fucked in the sense that it's heading towards ecological and social collapse. And that's what the physics is predicting, right? It's not a social theory, it's to do with where the ice melts and all the rest of it. So what it's necessary to do, in my view, though, is not just criticize, but actually be clear about what happens in history when you get this episode. And these episodes happen again and again. I mean, there's nothing unusual in history. Elites collapse and they collapse and they collapse again. It's not an unusual event. But my understanding is that elites collapse not through people working in the system, but through people working outside the system. And one of the interesting things, of course, is how this debate is framed is how do we get rid of Biden? The assumption is that it's a political thing. You have to have a political party. In Britain, we say the only way you get rid of the Tories is by voting for the Labour Party and what have you. And the whole sort of history of radical social movements and civil resistance seems to be written out of the frame. And the fact of the matter is, regimes collapse all the time because people go onto the streets. So can you say a little bit, drawing on your own experience, of how this supposedly impossible, non-existent event actually happens?
Well, I've watched it happen. I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I covered the two Palestinian uprisings or intifadas. I covered the street demonstrations that brought down Slobodan Milosevic. We know how it happens. But you need a critical mass who discredit the system nonviolently. Why nonviolently? I know you know. It's because no revolution succeeds unless a significant sector of the foot soldiers of the ruling elite, i.e. the police, in some cases the military, refuse to defend the regime. They don't even have to side with the people seeking to bring down the centers of power. So, for instance, when the Shah flees Iran in 1979, the head of the armed forces said that he will not order anyone in the armed forces to defend the regime. That was it. Over and over, we've seen was certainly true in Eastern Europe, in East Germany. I was there when Erich Honecker, the dictator of East Germany, the communist dictator, sent down an elite paratroop division in September of 1989 to Leipzig, which was the epicenter of the protest movement. And the paratroopers, actually the local communist officials, refused to deploy the paratroopers on the street because their sons and daughters and relatives were all on the street. That's how you break a movement. And you cannot break a power movement unless there are defections in every, and this is true in the French Revolution, the American Revolution, unless there are significant parts of the elite that sever relations with the central power and turn on it. And so that's what we have to do. It's difficult now because the tools of mass surveillance and repression are far more sophisticated than they were in the past. However, the East German Stasi state was a pretty efficient police state, and yet it was brought down. And I think that the elites know how fragile their grip on power is. They know, at least intellectually, that the policies that they are pushing through have almost no popular support at all. In fact, are contrary, as you pointed out, to popular will. And so we're already seeing, certainly in the United States, the use of militarized police, using lethal force during these protests over the George Floyd killings. You saw journalists attacked, algorithms are being used. Silicon Valley is bonded at the hip to the security apparatus to shut out journalists such as myself, Matt Taibbi, all sorts of others who go after the primacy of corporate power. So yes, this is the only route. I'm not naive enough to tell you it's going to work, but the idea that we're somehow going to appeal to Joe, this is what I'm watching right now, appeal to Biden and remind Biden that progressives voted for him is just embarrassing and humiliating, because Biden could care less. He pays tremendous sums of money from corporations. But if you count the super PACs, many people think 3 times the money that Trump. Super PACs are dark money, which are allowed in American elections. Nobody knows where the money comes from half the time, but they're not officially part of the campaign, although the super PACs are used to fund the campaign. So Biden knows who he works for. I just find the political naivete on the part of the self-identified liberals and progressives embarrassing.
Yeah, and again, this comes back to a sort of gritty realism of revolution, isn't it? Is that at a certain stage in history, the people that are naive, the people that don't understand how history works, are the reformists, because the only opening for structural change is through a revolution. And the other thing I want you to comment on is, one of the criticisms I get a lot of the time, and you see this on the sort of defeatist left all the time is, this is a great idea, Roger, having revolution, having structural change, but, it's never going to happen because people aren't going to come out in the street. It doesn't happen in Western democracies. It's some weird thing that happens just in the global South and what have you. But the fact of the matter is with revolutions in the past, people were saying that all the time before they happened everywhere. I remember before in 2012, people, all the main commentators on the liberal left were saying, yes, there's a little bit of disruption in Tunisia, but there'll never be a successful revolution. And suddenly, out of nowhere, and this is always the phrase, isn't it? Out of nowhere comes, the Egyptian revolution. And I remember reading about the Iranian revolution. It was a stable, well-run, middle-income country, supportive of the West. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, this revolution appears. And of course, the classic example is 1989, isn't it? Where everyone and their dog was saying, the Soviet empire is going to last forever. A bit like they're saying the neoliberal empire is going to last forever. And then suddenly, shockingly, all these people that studied the Soviet Union and what have you for 30 years, they're all proved wrong. So, how do you explain that, Chris? Because, you were there, weren't you, on some of these occasions?
Because they only talk to the elites. I mean, the CIA, for instance, had not a clue that the Shah was about to be overthrown, because all they did was sit around and drink with Iranian generals. I've encountered this my whole life as a reporter. The only way to know is to be, if you're in Gaza, in the refugee camps in Gaza. It's not sitting around the Fatah headquarters in Tunis, or eventually in Gaza itself. It's not interviewing Israeli intelligence experts. So those people who say they didn't have a clue, it's because they remained within that bubble. I covered, for instance, the war in Kosovo. I made the first trip with my photographer, Wade Goddard, with armed units of the Kosovo Liberation Army, and we published with pictures on the front page of the New York Times. And the other reporters who were sitting around talking about to diplomats and analysts in Belgrade said, oh, the Kosovar Albanians will never fight. It's not. And then, as you put it, out of nowhere. Well, it's out of nowhere because they're out of touch. And one of the reasons that I clash so often with the liberal elite is because in every single one of my books, I spend hundreds of hours in poor communities interviewing people, including many Trump supporters. My last book, America, the Farewell Tour, I'm in Anderson, Indiana. Anderson, Indiana was once a center for the production of GM cars. Over 25,000 good paying union jobs with benefits and pension plans and medical benefits, and then all the auxiliary businesses that depend on GM. So the whole city. And then with NAFTA, the plants they were literally bulldozed down. They're just giant weed choked lots now behind cyclone fencing. The jobs all go to Mexico, where workers make $3 an hour without benefits. And the city goes into a death spiral with all of the attendant problems that come with despair: alcoholism, opioid addiction, domestic abuse, suicide. And they weren't going to vote for, this was back in 2016, Clinton. They actually voted for Sanders in the primary, but they weren't going to vote for Clinton. They knew what Clinton had done to them. So the problem with the elites is that they live in their own echo chambers in New York. Yeah. It's all the pundits on TV who all, they go to the same schools I went to. They live in the same elite circles, and they talk to each other. So yeah, they're the last to know. That was true, by the way, in the Russian Revolution. That they were.
Yeah, I think you're right. This sort of last to know thing is so true. And I've been in London 4 or 5 years now, and I've talked to people on the street. I've talked to through me being co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, I've had the dubious privilege of talking to many members of the liberal elite, as it were. I talked to the chief executive of Greenpeace, the editor of The Guardian. And, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say I'd be just totally horrified by the insularity of the liberal elite in the UK and their complete inability to understand their moral responsibilities, or even analytically to understand the potential for mass civil resistance, And as people may know, before Extinction Rebellion came along, most of the people I talked to who are supposedly analysts, they all unanimously said this isn't possible. It's not possible to get, thousands of people on the street. People will never want to be arrested. And then suddenly it happens, and then they sort of half change their tune, but they haven't changed their tune fundamentally. And one of the things that became apparent to me very quickly is that it's mainly low middle class people and even working class people in the regional towns, not the liberal professional elites of London and Brighton and, the major metropolitan centres, who are the people who are going to rebel. I did a speech at speeches last year, and when I went to talk in middle class suburbs, North London and what have you, I might get 10, 15% of people that are interested in civil disobedience. You went up to Scunthorpe or Derby, these places in the north of England, you get 40%. And I was going like, okay, so this is interesting. And I think this is a similar thing that you've noticed in the States, presumably, which is if you're actually out of those circles, you realize how massively discontented the ordinary people are. That's right, you went on a tour and what have you, didn't you?
Yeah, but I would also say that's why the liberal elites are hated, and they deserve to be hated. I mean, Fyodor Dostoyevsky understood this. I mean, this was a constant theme in his writing about the liberal class. If you look at The Underground Man, it is really a satire of liberalism. And it is, as Dostoevsky understood, and he talked about it, he said that when liberal elites fail to defend the ideals that they espouse, you enter what he called an age of moral nihilism. Read Dostoevsky. He does it in every book, but Notes from Underground is really kind of focused on it. And these are just sterile, defeated dreamers who hold up high ideals but refuse to defend them. And that bankrupt liberalism, which eschews any kind of moral center or passion and is completely Cartesian. It's always about being rational. Serves in the end to accommodate corrupt systems of power in the name of liberal ideals. And as Dostoevsky understood, because he didn't live for the Russian, he was dead when the Russian Revolution took place, but he knew where it was going, and he knew exactly what was going to happen. And so we're headed in a very similar direction, and our liberal elites have replicated the bankruptcy that is absolutely fundamental to the rise of despotism. People forget that in 1928, the Nazi Party in Germany was polling in the single digits. After the 1929 crash, the liberal elites ruling Weimar catered to the international banking system because of the loans they needed to keep the country afloat. And they actually abolished unemployment insurance at a time of massive unemployment. And we're seeing much the same now in the United States. Unemployment benefits are about to run out at the end of the year, and nobody's making any move to extend them. The supplemental benefits of $600 a month ran out at the end of August. Real unemployment, because the figures are fixed. If you count people who have stopped looking for work, or people who have been furloughed but won't be rehired, or people who work part-time and are still below the poverty line, real unemployment is probably close to, LA Times estimates 17%, but certainly close to 20%. And we are now with the fallout of the pandemic, and the system can't take any more stress. This is the part of what happens in a decayed system. But the fallout from the pandemic now, in terms of evictions and foreclosures, we're talking about potentially by January, 35 million Americans will be in danger of being evicted from their homes because they can't pay their rent. The figures of people dying from COVID, an estimated 300,000 by December, 400,000 by January, and the University of Washington just released a study that said 500,000 by February. And our for-profit healthcare system, which again is just about commodifying health. We have less than 1 million hospital beds. Cities like Milwaukee have had a wrecked field hospital, tents in the middle of the city. 48% of frontline workers still don't get sick pay. So all of these figures, and over 40 million Americans have lost their employer-sponsored health insurance. So all of these figures, which we know is coming. It's why, by the way, banks in the United States are not lending money, because they know that there is going to be a massive default on student loans, car loans, mortgages. Some big banks like Wells Fargo have a complete moratorium on lending. And what will be the response of a neoliberal Biden administration? It will be to employ the primary mechanisms of social control, which are militarized police and prisons and wholesale surveillance.
Yeah. So a lot of people know that we've got this crisis and it's getting worse and worse. And we all know that a crisis basically leads to this structural social disruption. We never can guarantee it. We never know quite when it might happen, but we know we're in the ballpark of it. And if you look at the sociology of revolution, which is one of the things I study, there's this concept of the fiscal crisis of the state, that the elites progressively at different times in history destroy the state through their own greed and their own incompetence. And we can see this obviously very clearly most especially in America, but across the Western world, that when the chips are down, the elites are basically looking after themselves, as we see this in the UK, that, the stinginess of what is being given to people that are losing their jobs, small business people, who are doing essential services and what have you, they're in poverty, and the corporate class is given the subsidies. So there's nothing historically that unusual about that. What we see, though, is through this fiscal crisis of the state, you're basically shaking the dice on what, historically is called a revolutionary period. And people, can't quite get their heads around that. But what we're saying is basically that's what we're heading towards. And what I just want to spend a few minutes looking at is how that happens, because one of my criticisms of social movements since 1989 is this horizontalist dogma that you can have an uprising and you can have social disruption, but you can't have a leadership. And my understanding is one of the reasons why social movements have failed, in order to actually take power or to destroy power, however you want to construct it, is because they have a big uprising, but then there's nowhere to go. Like in France in 2018, I think there was like 100 different initiatives on what the people wanted. Similarly, of course, with Occupy. And the same sort of thing is happening with Extinction Rebellion, with the inability to come to collective decisions. While my understanding is, like before 1989 and in the 20th century, there was a clear leadership structures, and there was someone who could negotiate with the government and negotiate with the elite and say, you're leaving, we're coming in, and we're going to institute a new form of people's democracy. So is that how you see it? And, tell us a little bit about your experiences of how regimes actually do change in practice, in historical practice.
Well, regimes crumble from within. That's, they become decayed. So the edifice remains. When I first went to East Germany, the Stasi state had all of the, the facade and all of the instruments and institutions that had allowed it to maintain control, for decades. And yet internally, they were rotting from within. East Germany did not have a strong centralized leadership. It was mostly started by Lutheran clergy in Leipzig, but East Germany was absorbed by West Germany. That was one scenario. Then in Czechoslovakia, where I was every night in the Magic Lantern Theater with Václav Havel and Klaus and Dinsbier and everyone else, you had a very clear leadership. I mean, what was always attractive to me about Czechoslovakia is that they weren't politicians. They were all artists and playwrights, and Dinsbier had been a blacklisted journalist. And then I covered Romania, where the Securitate stepped in and essentially hijacked the uprising to put all of, they got rid of Ceausescu and his wife, of course. So it can play out in all sorts of different ways. I don't think that any revolution has been successful that I know of without a leadership. And this is both an asset and a curse, because leaderships can be decapitated. So for instance, I covered the uprising in Algeria after the coup, after the Islamic, the FIS won in the elections of '92. And because the Islamics' political leadership was all public, they were instantly decapitated. Most of them probably were killed. And then you got the Jamaat Islamiyah, the more radical Salafist Islamists who were underground, who carried out a kind of prolonged war of attrition, which the French, aiding the military government in Algeria, eventually crushed. So yes, I think that leadership is important, but it also makes the movement more vulnerable, because those leaders, because they have a public profile, can be replaced. But finally, yeah, I mean, I was very involved in Occupy in the States, and they were kind of feeling their way forward. They learned a lot. They were eventually, we must not forget, the entire Occupy movement was crushed was literally the encampments were eradicated in a coordinated national effort out of the White House of Barack Obama. I think that there needs to be, in the end, the most successful revolution in Eastern Europe, although it was hijacked by, neoliberals in the end, was because you could talk to Havel, and who eventually, of course, became the president of the Czech Republic. So, I think that in the end, and also because consensus, Kropotkin actually writes quite well about the policy of consensus, and he makes a point that I think is probably correct and would be true from my own experience in Occupy. When Occupy was small at the beginning, it was only, tiny, few dozens of people. Consensus works, and Kropotkin says it will work in groups of 150. Once you get over 150, consensus becomes paralysis, and that is what happened in Occupy. Once you had thousands of people at a meeting with one person able to administer a veto, I think the police very quickly figured this out. So yes, I think that in the end, and I would also just say that there were leaders in Occupy. This would be true in Zuccotti. They just weren't public. The Direct Action Committee, at one point, they were all in my house in Princeton planning what they were going to do when the police came to shut them down. There was a leadership. They just weren't public. And I think probably that's the most successful form of leadership. It is a leadership that doesn't descend into a kind of personality cult, and where the hierarchy itself remains in the background.
Yeah. So, as we all know, like, bringing about radical political change is a little bit tricky. Otherwise, people have done it lots of times before. So, but the fact of the matter is this is where we're heading, and this is what we need to try and design to the best of our abilities. And as you've correctly said, the major determinant, as you might say, is the crumbling from within of the system, because the system eats itself up.
Hey, Roger, let me just make a point there that in those revolutions, people turned to those figures like Havel, who had never wavered, even though their stance and call for truth and democrat was completely quixotic. And so this is a message the liberal class has failed to appreciate, that in moments of extremity, people will get behind those who have held fast no matter what, who they can trust.
Well, this leads us on to this final sort of criteria, I suppose, or issue, which is expediency versus the truth, as I see it. And again, like, historically, we've had these, broadly two strategies, which is say what will be effective or say what will be true. And what I think you've just identified is, at times of massive social crisis, the truth becomes something which is enormously powerful in a way that it doesn't when everything's just trundling along. And I think you've been one of the few figures, and I think the reason why people are attracted to you is because people know you have that integrity, and people listen to you because you're not going to lie to them just in order to get a TV interview or get in the New York Times and all the rest of it. And similarly, to the extent that I could get myself organized, I do the same thing. At the end of the day, I'm here to say what I think. People aren't interested, and so be it. I'll go back onto my farm and weed spinach, right? But I'm not going to play this game of going, well, we might upset that group, or, we might, if we say that will happen. It's more like, this is the situation. This is how I see it. You can disagree with me, that's fine. But this is the truth, and this is what needs to be said. So how just say a little bit more about how you see this dynamic happening. And I think the Czechoslovakia example, of course, is famous, but it's not the only example, is it, of people that speak truth in a prophetic way having enormous influence at times of social crisis?
Well, because in a moment of social crisis where the elites are desperate to cover up the truth about themselves, truth has a cost. And so if you get up and speak truth in moments of extremity, then you have to be willing to pay a price, as Havel did. Havel was imprisoned, and if you wanted to hear Havel's voice or listen to his plays, you had to turn on Voice of America. So it's those who are willing to pay the price, and people want to know that they can trust you if they're going to make that step forward, which puts themselves in jeopardy and creates insecurity and legitimate fear of repression. They have to know that you're not going to waver. And that's why in all of the revolutions I covered, people turned to those figures, one of whom was Abu Jihad and the PLO, who the Israelis assassinated for exactly that reason. So that's absolutely key and people knew. I mean, Havel, interesting, had no charisma, really. He was not a very good public speaker, but there was no question during the revolution who you turn to, because since 1977, when he started Charter 77, Havel had stood fast, no matter what. He wrote a beautiful essay called Living in Truth. And that is key, but it's not just that you speak it, it's that you're willing to pay the price for speaking it. So what's interesting is I just anecdotally will run into fervent Trump supporters who know who I am. I was in Washington, right before the pandemic, waiting in line, and a woman behind me said, "I know who you are, I know your name, and I know what you write, and I really admire what you do, and I voted for Trump." Now that it becomes dangerous, because I'm a socialist. I'm a self-declared socialist, which are supposed to be the enemy of everything Trump and the neo-fascists stand for. But she knew I was honest. And I think that that's key in moments of, and that's what what I have now watched, especially with the Biden election once again. We saw Glenn Greenwald from The Intercept censored, and then he had the integrity to leave, and he published the whole back and forth with the editors. I've read it. That is censorship. I've been a journalist for many years. There's absolutely it's not in any doubt. And what did the so-called liberal elites who run The Intercept now do? All they did was a character assassination. They didn't respond to the facts. And so you can actually when you have that integrity, you can cross those political divides, because people know you're not trying to spin them.
Yeah, well, this is interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's this theory of politics that it's about ideas, and obviously partially it is. It's about left-wing ideas and right-wing ideas. But what I think people forget, particularly like conventional political analysts and obviously people in the elites, is more deeper than that. Politics is about trust, particularly, as you say, at times of social crisis, that people will move towards people that have integrity, and they know they're not going to lie, because they've been lied to for so long by so many people. And it doesn't actually matter, as you've said with the Trump supporters spoke to you, like the actual surface politics becomes secondary to this idea of, are they part of them? And I've talked to people that in the UK about putting up ordinary candidates in elections. And I talked to one of the guys that organizes this, and I was saying to him, what is it about, creating independent political, candidates in town councils and what have you? What's the attraction? Is it something the policies they have or whatever? He said, no. It's like when you're knocking on the door and someone opens the door and they see a normal person like them standing for election. It doesn't actually really matter what they say. It's more like, oh my God, it's a normal person. I'm going to vote for them, rather than one of these suits that's got a script and, is told by some party hierarchy what to say, because, you don't want people going off message and all that bollocks, right? It's like, it's more instinctive, isn't it? And this instinctiveness, of course, is poo-pooed by people that are supposedly very intelligent. But there's a certain intuition about integrity, which in times like these, people vote for. And you saw this with Corbyn, of course, and you see it all across the Western world. Is people are sucked into, convinced that people on the radical right are doing it. Obviously, that's sort of manufactured, or you know, they're duping people, or you get people on the left like you, and people are going, oh, you know, this guy actually doesn't just fall in with all the crap that I've had to deal with, so I'll vote for him. So it seems like this is a dynamic these people don't really understand. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, Corbyn was crucified for all of the qualities we just mentioned.
Yeah.
It will take a lot of people down. And, you know, I know from experience that at the beginning of a incendiary or revolutionary process, you know, people who have a high profile, they know on which doors to knock. Well, knock. They know on which doors to knock down.
Yeah.
And that is just an inevitable process. So the people who usually the people who start revolutions don't finish them. But yes, I think it is that integrity and it's courage. I mean, it's the courage to stand fast for what you believe in, no matter what the consequences are. And people are not going to step out of their own secure, self-indulgent little worlds unless they know that the people who are asking them to take those risks are going to risk everything with them. In fact, risk more. I mean, this is what made Martin Luther King or Malcolm X such effective leaders, because they, you know, and we often minimize Martin Luther King. Malcolm said very incendiary things, but he did it in Harlem. For King to get up in Mississippi or Georgia and say what he said took perhaps even, I think, more. I love Malcolm X, but he took more courage.
Yeah.
And of course, they were both assassinated in the end. So that's the price of defiance. And we can't sugarcoat it. I mean, we're not walking into some kind of wonderful new brave new world. We're walking into a clash with power elites who will do everything possible to maintain power, and they will stop at nothing.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we'll leave it there. I just want to summarize some of the things we've been saying, because I think it's interesting to talk about what the key, some of the key elements are in the success that we need to create. We've established that you need these mass movements. That's what we saw in Eastern Europe and what have you. And at the same time, you need a leadership or some people that will talk to the government and what have you. And obviously there's problems with that, but you need to have some structure. And lastly, we need truth telling, right? And I think one of the interesting things about Burning Pink is trying to iterate basically on what's come before. There's an international movement, as we're both aware, of different movements around the world fumbling forward, I suppose you might call it, in trying to get the right formula, get the right balance on these very complicated issues. But this is the work that we have to do, isn't it? And one of the things Burning Pink is doing, and one of the fundamental things I think we've talked about, is when you put ordinary people up for election, then you have that trust. And it's like, okay, they're one of us, there's someone we can trust, or ordinary people that have made sacrifices for the common good. And at the same time, you need to have organization, and at the same time, obviously, you need to have civil disobedience. But it's this core idea, I think, we've established, which is in times of social disruption, truth is not just a moral imperative, it's actually strategically smart. That seems to be the case. Is there any other sort of final points you'd like to make, Chris, before we finish in all this?
No, I mean, just that it's going to get, certainly I don't follow the UK, but it's going to get very, very ugly in the United States if Trump, as I expect, eventually leaves the White House but continues to insist that the election was fraudulent and rigged. You have tens of millions of people in the country who no longer believe in the electoral system. And we are a very, very violent culture. It's in our DNA. And the country is awash in militarized weapons, which you can buy over the counter. And I expect the next stage, I fear, will be the political violence directed not at people like me, although I've had my moments, but probably at the mainstream Democratic Party for stealing the election. That's my fear.
Yeah. And our structural response to that has to be organizing, hasn't it?
Yeah.
You know, that's the big variable here. Does a country have a grassroots democratic mobilizing culture? And I guess, as I say, many organizations are looking at this in networks, and Burning Pink is spreading around the world now in terms of creating people's assemblies, putting up candidates, but more especially creating this empowerment culture, which is going to be necessary, which you've both identified. You know, this crash is coming. It's locked in now, socially and ecologically. There's no question about that. The question is, are we going to go for a radical, progressive, compassionate, democratic culture, or are we going to descend into fascism? And that seems to be the choice ahead of us. So thanks, Chris. Lots to do. And I'll speak to you again soon. And thank you for everyone watching this video, and best of luck to everyone. Thanks very much.